Okay.
Professor, you can begin.
Okay. Good evening, friends. It's a pleasure to be back again before this group now. And our speaker this evening, perhaps morning in Ireland, is Mr. Donal Creedon. Donal is not new to this group. He has spoken before. And for those who are joining this group for the first time, I'll briefly introduce Donal to you. Donal was born and educated in Dublin, Ireland. At the age of 19, he came across Krishnamurti and attended his talks in Sarnen, Switzerland. He was deeply affected by Krishnamurti's presence and the teachings. The message seemed straightforward and unambiguous. However, after some years listening at the feet of the master, he felt stuck and went to study with Buddhist masters from Tibet. Although he states he had no interest in becoming a Buddhist, he left his job as a civil servant and spent 12 years in enclosed retreats. During that time, he was appointed retreat master of a 3-year retreat. In spite of appearances, Krishnamurti remained a constant and invisible presence in his life, challenging at every step. Later, at the behest of Rajesh Dalal, a trustee of the Krishnamurti Foundation, India, he took up the Buddha Krishnamurti Scholarship in Rajghat. The outcome was published as The Main of Light, Common Ground and Dividing Lines in the Teachings of J. Krishnamurti and Buddhism, which he says is an inquiry into the ways of exploring the fundamental questions of life. Until the arrival of COVID, he was involved in retreats in various parts of the world, and I think that continues now. Donald is going to talk to us on a theme, consciousness in Krishnamurti and Mahayana Buddhism, a question of transformation. I want to extend a very warm welcome to Donald and also want to thank him on behalf of JK Study Circle Indore for accepting our invitation and being with us today. With these words and once again a very warm welcome to Donald, I'll request him to please go ahead with his talk. And as usual, you can take as long as you want, but perhaps about an hour, after which we'll leave the floor open for people to ask questions or make comments. So Donald, it's your turn now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me here and inviting me to speak. And it's always good to see all friends and the Indian friends in particular in this case. So I'll just go straight into our topic and begin by saying that actually the topic, I was thinking about it, it's a little bit a difficult topic in many ways. And in fact, I doubt very much if I'll really speak about the topic as it's presented in the, consciousness in Krishnamurti and Mahayana Buddhism, which gives the impression of some kind of lecture, somewhat academic lecture, but I think that would not be so helpful, and perhaps it would be too many details involved with that. But one of the reasons for taking this topic is, I think, something that we perhaps all experience at different times in our journey of inquiry, is that sometimes a particular saying of Krishnamurti or a saying from the Buddha of some sort strikes us and remains with us. And so in my own case, I was always struck by Krishnamurti when he spoke about consciousness. And he talked about consciousness and the necessity to empty consciousness of its contents. And this at first didn't really make much sense to me. He stressed again and again when he spoke about consciousness or the nature of consciousness, he always said that consciousness and its contents are indivisible. There's no consciousness other than the contents of consciousness. And if we're to bring about a fundamental change in ourselves or a change in humanity, we could put it in different ways. It's necessary to effect a transformation of consciousness. And sometimes Krishnaji talked about emptying the consciousness of its contents. So it's really around this these statements of Krishnamurti. I thought we could look into this statement and see what emerges from looking into it. Because, as I said, like on a personal level, when I heard this statement, it seemed again like so much Krishnaji. He would make some quite extraordinary statement, which was not really understandable in usual way. And particularly when he talked about maybe consciousness and the contents being one, this maybe we could understand that. But when he spoke about the necessity of emptying the consciousness of its contents, that this is where, in my own case, it's caused me to think about this or to look into it a little bit. And then in the process of looking into this, then I was also acquainted with certain teachings on the consciousness and the nature of consciousness in the Buddhist tradition, and more specifically, a particular area of the Buddhist tradition in the Mahayana tradition, where the question of the consciousness, the nature of consciousness, the function of consciousness, and how it functions is gone into in considerable detail. But as I said, to go into that and give any kind of coherent and comprehensive account of that is beyond probably my capacity, but certainly beyond the capacity to explain it within the time frame that we're given. But what I thought to share or to explore with you is to take some particular points in this and look into them a little more deeply, as it were. I think in considering anything of Krishnaji's teaching, one finds that it's a very extraordinary and vast teaching. And he, over his long life, he addressed the problems of living, the fundamental problems of living, in many different ways. He would take up a particular topic, say the topic such as fear, or he could take a topic such as the nature of love, the nature of compassion, and go into it in great depth and great thoroughness. And although there are like many topics which he went into, it could seem there's a multiplicity of topics. They seem all, whatever way, I would suggest that Krishnaji went about it. The issues or the problems that he was getting at would emerge, whether he was talking about love, whether he was talking about what is fear, whether he was talking about violence, all the problems, they would come down to certain key points in his, call it dharma, in his communication of truth. And this is that the basic background is and the similar background to the teachings of the Buddha is the state of the human being or the sentient being, which one in our short life is one often of continual struggle, continual various forms of suffering, sorrow, fear, and so forth, that seems to constitute the content of the human condition. And so Krishnaji asked, and the Buddha asked, is there a possibility of another way of living? If there's an end to that, is there another way of living? Now, Krishnaji and the Buddha said, yes, there is. But to go to to resolve the fundamental problems that human beings have, it requires that we go right into the heart of the matter. Where is the source of the problem? And we could say the source of the problem lies in the mindset, the mind of the human being. We could say the mind of the human being or the consciousness of the human being. So as I understand Krishnamurti's teaching, he said clearly there's a problem in the human consciousness. There's a problem in humanity which doesn't belong to any particular country or race, but there's a problem right in the very consciousness itself. And unless this problem is seen into or seen clearly and resolved, then we'll have the continuity of the kind of great problems we see manifest in the world today. We see tremendous problems in the world today. The war in the Ukraine and Russia and wars everywhere, they're the ones that get a lot of attention. Then the problems brought about by climate change, the rampant greed that is there, the destruction of nature, destruction of the earth itself, and really very, very extreme manifestations in the world of what the human beings are doing to themselves and the planet. Unfortunately, it seems to be the case that most of the people looking for the solutions to these problems are again looking outwardly, and only not so many will look inwardly. But this is where Krishnaji and the Buddha point, is that unless we deal with the roots or the source of the problems, then, to use a Buddhist term, the wheel of samsara, the wheel of suffering, will just keep revolving round and round. And the wheel may be sometimes a little better or a little worse, but once the fundamental issue is there and not resolved, then the result is, to use the Buddhist phrase, dukkha, suffering, distress, pain, and so forth. Now, Krishnaji would make statements like, he would make a statement like, sorrow is the ground on which we all stand. Suffering is the ground on which all human beings stand. Another statement of his, he said, the root of that is the thought itself and the activities of thought. But first of all, I thought just to restate something which you would know very well, that in looking into these, even it seems like an abstract topic like consciousness and what is, for somebody who's seriously inquiring, then it's not just an intellectual game, but I would say looking into again, what Krishnaji points out, the source of our human dis-ease and distress and so forth. Now, so there is that general, let's say, problem. We have our individual issues and problems and fears and so forth. But one of the points that Krishnaji makes, I think is very much there in the Buddhist teaching, that unless we go to the root of it, then we'll solve one problem, another will appear, and there's no end to it really. Now, then we'd have to ask then what is the root problem? What's the root of the human problem? Now, Krishnaji has, of course, spoke about this extensively. And he would say different things at different times. He would put it in a different ways. I think in his latter part of his life in particular, he stressed that how thought was a prime agent in the human problem. And you will be probably familiar with his dialogues with David Bohm and so forth. And we went into the problem of thought and why thought is such a problem. He would sometimes identify it in a very simple way, well, seemingly simple way, at least the words are simple, the basic split in between the observer and the observed, between the thinker and the thought, between me and you, between me and the world. So in that he's pointing out, let's say, the basic dualistic split between the subjective me and the so-called objective world, or me and myself, me and my body, me and my thoughts, me and my feelings, me and so forth. So he pointed out that's a basic fundamental flaw in this way, and that the resolution was to understand, for instance, it's a well-known phrase that the observer is the observed. He would suggest by just understanding that, by an insight into that, then the root of the problem is cut through, and so the matter ends there, as it were. So in the Buddhist teachings, the Buddha identified the root problems. Mainly in the Buddhist discourse, there's two areas which are pointed out. One is the craving. Now, when we talk about craving, it's not just you like a certain this or that. I like coffee, or I like tea, or I like, but it's a more deep-rooted kind of movement of wanting and needing, which seems to be very strong in our life. And a manifestation, I think, a very strong manifestation outwardly of this force of craving is the kind of rampant greed in the world, and the whole, as we call it, consumerism, the consumer kind of mentality, where in our successful economies, if they're successful, then we have to be consuming a lot. The more we consume, the more successful the economy is. So we're encouraged to consume more and more. But if we look at this, the mindset that is always consuming, gathering more and more, what does it bring about? Now, both the Buddha and Krishnamurti said it'll bring about distress, it'll bring about dissatisfaction, it'll bring about suffering. Now, it doesn't take a great amount of examination to see the truth of that. But still, the forces of craving and desire are quite strong in the human psyche, mind, and so these things do not just disappear by simply acknowledging them. So this is one area. The other, which is the main point, which we find in Mahayana Buddhism, and say, if we can call it Tibetan Buddhism, they identify the main source of the problem, the human problem, as being ignorance. Ignorance meaning a lack of understanding, a lack of awareness, or making some kind of fundamental, there's a constant kind of mistake being made in the consciousness. Now, in one level, the mistake is that we take things to be permanent, which are not permanent. And we try to secure ourselves by pursuing things which cannot give security. And this creates more of the same, more dukkha, more suffering. So in the Buddhist thinking, it would be because we don't understand that things are impermanent, we don't understand that things, when they're grasped, are the nature of distress or suffering, and we don't understand the nature of the self, which is not something solid, immutable, and permanent. It's because of these misunderstanding, this gives rise to fundamental mistakes operating in mind, operating consciousness. Now, we can leave that aside for the moment because we go further in that, in the, let's say, what developed further in the Buddhist teachings, particularly Mahayana and in Zen and in Tibet, they identified the ignorance as being more, it brings it closer to home, not understanding one's own mind, not understanding the nature of mind itself. We could say not understanding the nature of consciousness. We could say also not understanding there's three things that are, they all come down, coalesce here. Not understanding the nature of one's mind, not understanding the nature of awareness, not understanding the nature of thought. Now, when we say not understanding the nature of mind, it means not recognizing who we are in a deeper, more fundamental sense. But I'll come back to that a bit later. So the mistake, there's a mistake around our very sense of who we are, around the self, around who I am, and the whole activity and project of the self to build itself up, to protect itself, to augment itself, to protect itself from change, and so forth. So now, if we go, now Krishnamurti, as I said, in some of his teachings, he talked about ignorance, but more specifically, he talked about the role of thought. So one of the things is I'll just talk a little bit about consciousness and what when we talk about consciousness, because this is what I'm supposed to talk about today. What exactly are we talking about when we talk about consciousness? Now, if we look at the, particularly the language, original language, I would say Sanskrit, and I'm more familiar personally with Tibetan than Sanskrit, but the language, those languages are, let's say, pregnant with meaning, which we don't find in the English or so much in European languages, as far as I know. But for example, the word consciousness in the Sanskrit was vijnana, and the root there is, I'm sure my pronunciation is incorrect, jnana, and it's jna, is to know, and the vijnana can mean a number of things. It can mean divided knowing. It can mean a discriminating kind of awareness. And so we have this V is in English, we could have distinguish or discriminate would be equivalent to those as were parts of the English words. So, but if we take that a little further, when in the Buddhist tradition, when they talk about consciousness, it means it talks about consciousness as a problem, consciousness per se, as it is configured, as it operates, is problematic. Now, as far as I can see, Krishnaji talks about consciousness in the same way. He used very different language, but what I'm getting at here, Krishnaji said consciousness as it operates is the problem. The Buddhists are saying consciousness as it operates is a problem. And the consciousness is like an operating system which has a fundamental flaw in the system. And so in the normal, if I say normal human life, when we encounter problems, we try to address the problems, but it's usually the problems are approached within that same field, within the same program of the consciousness itself. And I think this is one of the reasons why Krishnaji points out again and again is that we cannot really resolve these fundamental problems within that, let's say the field of consciousness as it's configured. Okay, so just to go into this a little more, and particularly to touch on the Krishnaji's statement about consciousness and its content. So we'd have to ask ourselves, well, what does that mean? What are the contents of consciousness? Now, I will just try to find a quotation which well, he says things like, I don't have a really proper quotation here. No, so I have some. He says the content of consciousness is and then he says that like I'm conditioned. I'm conditioned from childhood. I'm conditioned as wherever we're born, as Indian, as Irish, as whatever. So we're conditioned from birth onwards. And we're conditioned, we have, just a sec. It doesn't matter, I haven't found my quotation. But as far as I recall, he says that when he talks about the content of consciousness, he's basically talking about the totality of our conditioning. But when he goes a little further into this, again, he comes back to the key point. He says all of this conditioning is created by thought. So he puts thought at the, as it were, as the, when you talk about the content of consciousness as thought, the products of thought. However, I think for most of us, this seems rather like rather reductionist. And so we'd have to look a bit more into what does he mean by thought. And also, see what exactly does it encompass? Because I think what he means by thought is not our usual idea of just certain conceptual kind of thoughts, but the whole movement of, you could say the whole movement of consciousness, he, as far as I can understand, he says it's a movement of thought. More, David Bohm went into this quite extensively later on. And I think what Bohm has said is very much relevant to what we're going into, because he talked about thought not so much as, like when we use the word content, we might say like the content of the room here. There's a couch here, there are cushions here, there are books here, and so forth. So there are things in the room. Is consciousness like that? It does comprise of things, a whole collection of things that, but it seems it's not quite like that. So David Bohm particularly talks of it as thought as a system, as a whole movement. And I think it's closer, if we want an image which will describe the contents of consciousness, and the contents of consciousness and consciousness not being different, is if we compare it to a river. So the river, what does the river comprise of? It's water, and the movement of that water. and it's a constant movement, constant flow. So the great river Ganga, which I spent a few years living beside in Rajghat, you look at that river, it has a tremendous volume, and you have the name of the river, the Ganga, the Ganges. And maybe 1,000 years ago, the people were on the side of the river. They worshipped the river. But that river, 1,000 years ago, or even yesterday, or even 5 minutes ago, is an ever-changing movement. But still, it's definitely the river Ganga, and it has certain characteristics. But if you say, what is the river, or what's going, it's not anything separate from the water. So the river is the content. The river is actually the content. If there's no water, there's no river. So in the same way, if there's the movement that we describe consciousness, if that isn't there, there's no consciousness. Okay. Now, I thought to also just expand on this notion of the content of consciousness, and here to bring in something from the Buddhist way of describing the consciousness and what the consciousness contains, so the content. And so it's said in the Buddhist text that the consciousness is just the sum total of these, they described in this way, of the virtuous, the non-virtuous, and neutral tendencies. And so those tendencies make up what they call the continuum of a sentient being, of a human being. And so again, the content, the container, is not different to the content. And again, it's like the flow of the water in a river. So one of the points about this, and one of the points about this in, I think, Krishnaji, is there is no underlying permanent substratum or entity involved in this. There is just this flow of, let's say, call it thought, the movement of thought, the movement of certain patterns. The Buddhists come up with terms like samskara and vasana. Maybe you're familiar with these terms, the kind of formations. The samskaras are more sometimes translated as karmic formations. But what that really means is the result of habit patterns which are created through action, and which remain as deposits in the consciousness and operate in the consciousness. So this constitutes part of that, the flow. And so this situation in the Buddhist thinking is also equivalent to what we talk a fundamental ignorance, and is therefore as the basis for, the distress or the suffering in what the Buddhists call samsara. More on this content. The content of consciousness is consciousness, and he's saying that the content of consciousness is largely made up of thought, or created by thought. So I thought if we could also look at a few points, again, from the Buddhist perspective on this, which I think amplifies it a bit more, we might get a more, let's say, expansive or complete kind of picture of the situation and the difficulty of the situation. So again, this word thought, what is the original, say, if we say in Sanskrit or Tibetan, as I said, I'm more familiar with the Tibetan terms than Sanskrit. And I've looked at these terms, and they're quite revealing in a way, because these terms are often translated in English as thought. but they have a lot more nuance to them than the word in the English. So, for example, again, forgive me but I'm familiar with these words. Like there's a few terms in Tibetan, which is Namtok and Tokpa and Kuntok. Now, because these words are connected with thought, but this word tok means something is created, something is formed, something is manufactured. It has the connotation of something constructing something, something is made in the mind. But it also has the connotation of something which is like fictitious, which isn't true, which is fake, and which creates some kind of illusion. And so when they speak about this in the tradition and in the talk about consciousness, it's spoken of in a way that is describing the problem of consciousness. So this ongoing movement, I call it consciousness, call it thought, call it the samskaras, or call it what you will. So there's an ongoing aspect which is constantly creating situations, and yet it's deluded. It's a deluded activity of the mind that constantly brings forth all kinds of appearances. So this activity brings forth all kinds of what they call deluded appearances, dualistic appearances, and literally building its own world, So, I mean, I think this is a very interesting point, and we can see it in operation in ourselves and in the world as how, our own mind is, or if we take problems in the world outside of us, how the mind constructs problems out of nothing, literally out of nothing. How I think anybody who's read or been serious about Krishnaji's teaching will see that, for example, nationalism is a poison, and we can see it's rampant in the world. We can see how these divisions foment hatred and foment divisions, wars and destruction. It's playing out on our news every day. But what is creating that division? What is creating the label? And what gives it a reality? Well, it's the consciousness. So the Buddhists are saying this is a problem. I think Krishnaji is saying the same. He said, this thought is not just inside my head taking place, but thought is much more, let's say, active outside of my head. And in fact, thought is in fact constructing my whole world of experience. Now, this is a little difficult to really, I think, understand in actuality, but it's something I think you or I, we can inquire into it, and we can inquire into it in terms of our own, like, personal experience of situations. A very simple one is that when you go to a place, say I visited, I was in Benares many times, in Rajghat. I say it's a wonderful place, a beautiful place. I love being there. I know somebody else has been saying, oh, it's a terrible place. It's awful. I can't stand that place. So I'll be saying Benares is a magical city. It's a wonderful city. Two people seeing the same place may say, no, it's terrible. It's awful. So where is the awfulness, or where is the beauty, or is it outside of the mind or consciousness? No, obviously not. But just a few more points before we move on. So again, at this term thought, contents of consciousness, what does it mean? What does it take into? So saying that the word thought doesn't quite cover that field. And So the conceptual, what we call conceptual thinking, which at least in the West is usually identified as thought, is only really a small part of this overall dynamic. Because when we look into this a bit more, it includes the consciousness. We use the word conscious, includes whatever is occurring within mind, but it also includes whatever appears to the mind. For example, I'm speaking, and I appear on your screen. You can hear me, and you have your laptop or your computer, and you see it there. But then, can we separate the experience of that from, is there something kind of objective that you can get a handle on there? Anything you can separate from the mind that is listening to this and possibly interpreting in a definite. So what's going on when we listen to somebody or we watch something, Is it the case that it exists somehow objectively as out there and you are looking at it from an objective point of view? According to Krishnaji and the Buddhists, they say, no, it's not like that. And so in some of the Buddhist teachings on this, they go even much further than this and say the whole activity of consciousness is, and there's a particular term used here, which has a Sanskrit and Tibetan thing. It says it's all the activity of false imagination. Now, I'm familiar again with the Tibetan term. It means yang dakma yimpa. I mean, it's not authentic, it's not true, and it's also created by the thought, So this, if we were to explore this a little more, perhaps we'd come to an understanding of when Krishnaji talked about you are the world and the world is you, in the light of understanding of consciousness and its all pervasiveness in our experience, then this perhaps begins to make sense. But I don't want to go too much further into this because now it becomes a little bit, complicated. But I wanted to just emphasize, when we talk about consciousness and the content of consciousness, then Krishna says, as far as I understand, he's talking about thought. In the Mahayana's text, also talking about in somewhat of a similar manner, but using a different kind of terminology, a more expansive view. Now, Krishnaji says, this has to end, if we're to end the human problem. Or, as you said, that the contents, we have to empty consciousness of the contents. Of course, a term like that, in the empty consciousness of a content, I think is, one cannot take it in a very literal way, I think. If we say, like, I have the room here, I can empty the room of the contents, but but empty consciousness of its contents, then we have to see there's some kind of, we'd have to unpack that a little more and not approach it in a very literal way, literal-minded way, So the question is, how does that whole, let's say, field of deluded thought-driven, how does that operating system, how does it come to an end? We could put it in different ways. Is it possible to transform it? Or is it possible for it to end? And how would that come about? Yeah, I mean, that's like, a fundamental question. Now, as always, with Krishnamurti, his, if you call a solution, is never like straightforward. For a start, Krishnaji denied all kinds of methods, and for obvious reasons. He denied that once you use a method, once you use a particular program, then you're back into the same old trap. He would also say that is it possible for like a fragment of that, call it consciousness, to affect the whole of it? So, for example, I think, okay, I'm going to do something about this. So the central headquarters decides to do something about the problem. But that very move is there's issues with that from the very beginning. There's contradictions in that move. Why? Because it's also bound in the same old, circle, as it were. I should have said about this, about the consciousness, about this. There's two kind of elements operating as, we say, within consciousness, which operate something as constants, as that seem to be permanent. One of them is the me, the observer. The observer, the sense of the center of the me, of the self, feels like it's separate, and that it can see things, and that it can see things objectively. So these things with the self, and then the object appearing is the other. So the two things, subject and object. So in the Buddhist thinking, this self and the things are again constructs. They're simply constructs of that whole activity, dynamic activity of thought and consciousness. But we won't go into that right now. That's a topic for another day, how that can come about. But just since I don't want to go too much beyond the time given, we could look at, so when Krishna talks about the content of content, emptying the consciousness of the concept, what could that mean? How could that come about? As I've just said, he denies all the methods, all the strategies, and so forth. And as I'm just repeating, for very good reason, because they're the methods, the strategies, again, constructs. They're constructs of thought. And he points out that the problem is created by thought, and then thought itself is trying to undo the problem it has created. And the problem with thought per se, it doesn't see what it's doing. It doesn't know what it's doing, doesn't see what it's doing. So there's a blindness in the operation of the thought. But because it's so part of our kind of operating system, there seems to be no other way than to go the way of thought now. And this is why it's difficult to, for, I think, the consciousness or for the individual to drop that strategy making kind of apparatus, which is always there, seems to be always there. And so this is one thing he said, no, this won't work. This will just, there will be continuity in that. So therefore, what will lead to the ending of the problem? Krishnaji points out, he says, meditation. Meditation is the ending of it. But again, when he talks about meditation, again, he's not talking about method. He's not talking about a program in meditation. He's not talking about applying mindfulness or vipassana as something like practicing something. But he's talking about a particular state. And what he says about meditation is very beautiful. He says, for example, I'm reading from what he says. He says meditation is one of the greatest arts in life. He says perhaps the greatest, and one cannot possibly learn it from anybody. And that is the beauty of it. And there's no technique and no authority. And he says, when you learn about yourself, watch yourself and watch the way you walk, how you eat, what you say, the gossip, the hate, and so forth. When you're aware of yourself, without any choice, that is part of meditation. Now, furthermore, he says about this, he says, the soil, the base, again, I'll read a quote from it. He says, the soil in which the meditative mind can begin is the soil of everyday life. The strife, the pain, the fleeting joy. He said it must begin there. But if you're concerned with making order, he said that would bring about its own limitation. So then he says something quite, as usual, extraordinary. He says, in all this movement, you must somehow begin from the other shore. The other shore. From the other end, the other shore, and not always be concerned with this shore or how to cross the river. You know, the river of consciousness, how to cross that river, if you could put it in that way. And he says you must take a plunge into the water, not knowing how to swim. So these are quite extraordinary statements. But where does it leave us? Where does it leave you and me? You know, where does you can perhaps tell me afterwards. But I wanted to also just to bring in a few points from, let's say, the Buddhist perspective. When I say Buddhist perspective, that can also give the wrong impression. It's not like there is a Buddhist perspective out there. There's some kind of equivalent to the, say, the Vatican or some organization that has an official Buddhist line. It is not like that at all. But when I say Buddhist perspective, more actually the perspective of what's in the teachings of the Buddha Dharma. Now, one thing when Krishnamurti talks about emptying consciousness of its contents, the two things came to mind in this respect. One would be coming from the, say, perspective of somebody like Nagarjuna, and Nagarjuna's insight, which also find a lot in the Krishnaji's teaching. Nagarjuna's insight would be that it may be not a matter of, emptying consciousness, because, and I will make this statement, because consciousness in itself is already empty. So there's no need to empty consciousness. This would be in the Heart Sutra, Nagarjuna, because consciousness in itself is already empty in itself. There's a well-known sutra, the Heart Sutra, which has statements: form is emptiness, emptiness is form, and so forth. But also in that it says consciousness is emptiness, emptiness is consciousness. Now, according to my understanding of what Nagarjuna is getting at, is if you or I understand the nature of consciousness, then the root of the problem is got through. The problem is the reification of thought processes in consciousness, which create then this solid sense of self and other. So I would say in this approach, in this particular approach of insight or prajna, that if the nature of consciousness, or the nature of is understood as it is, as being ungraspable, and not a thing, if there's a seven, then the root problem is got through. So it's not necessary to think in terms of emptying the consciousness of its content. This would be one thought on the matter. However, there's also something I came across in relation, which I found. I'll quote it to you. It's a rather language may be a little difficult, but I thought it was an extraordinary statement in relation to the problem of consciousness. And this comes from Asanga. Now, Asanga and Vasubandhu are also major figures in the Buddhist tradition, and particularly the Asanga and Vasubandhu went into this whole question of consciousness in an extraordinary way in their treatises. Now, take it again that consciousness itself is seen as a problem. And the question also seems to be implicit that how does it end? How does it come to an end? So I came across this, and this is a quote from Asanga. He says, the supramundane, just the pure mind, we could say, arises from the latent tendencies of listening that are the natural outflow of the pure Dharma Dhatu. Now, I'm aware that already, I mean, these terms are a little tricky. So it's saying that a different quality of mind, if we can put it this way, arises out of, there is a natural capacity to listen. There's a natural capacity to listen right in the very nature of the mind or the consciousness itself. So here it says, he talks about as the pure, it is the spatial phenomena. And furthermore, he says, these latent capacities of listening coexist with the consciousness. They're already somehow there. And he says, even when the change has not taken place, when that pure mind, which is outside of the consciousness, has not arisen, this capacity to listen, this latent tendency, are already work on the afflictions and, clear them. And then here's the point. He said, to the extent that it gradually increase the conscious.
Donal, we just lost you. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So what I think what I read out just now is saying that, which I was very, very interested, is talking about a capacity to listen. And the capacity to listen is innate. And when that capacity to listen is activated, this capacity, this listening quality already starts to change. The quote says that already that the consciousness itself begins to wane. The power of that consciousness begins until it disappears completely. So you might ask, well, when it disappears completely, what is there? What is the fact? And what is the reality? Well, that's something we can discuss. But it's suggested that what is there is this, what Krishnaji calls intelligence, the kind of innate intelligence, and the operates unimpeded. And this intelligence is is not belong to that that program, that default program of the operating system of consciousness. There's a few more points I could make about this, particularly in relation to meditation and how it can be approached through meditation, not exactly in the way that Krishnaji talked about, but more in the Buddhist tradition of meditation, by looking actually, by because it often appears that the problem is so big, consciousness is so vast, that where do we begin? But one strand, one insight is that if a single thought is understood, the nature of a single thought, then the root problem is dealt with in that single thought. So why? Because the problem will be the fundamental problem in the operating system will be running through everything that manifests. So this is the Krishnaji, when he talks about whatever problem is there, the roots of it will be the same. We have to get to the same roots of it. So if you solve a single thought, all the problems are resolved. I just throw that into the mix, and then I stop at this point because I think I've gone beyond the permitted time. But if there's any points of discussion that you wish to, or points anybody wishes to make, please do it. So Harshadji has raised his hand.
Thank you, Donald. I think you have very well explained the different ways of, consciousness as it is in Buddhist literature and Krishna. I want to say that Krishna used to say that the way we know consciousness is only through its contents, and that content is our knowledge, our experience, our conditioning, and many of it, like the genetic conditioning and cultural conditioning, come to us even before we are born. So the content is never empty. But and I don't know that stage where there is nothing in our consciousness which becomes completely empty. I don't know. I've never experienced that. Is that a vegetable state? But if we are aware of the content of the consciousness or any one of the disorders, then one can experience that that's the beginning of the freedom. Then we become free of that content. Before I come to my question, I want to mention that I could gather from your talk that in Buddhism, basically consciousness refers to one's self-awareness and one's capability to discern the various energies that influence their lives. But Buddhism also talks of 9 kinds of consciousness, including the sense organs. So would you say that the 9 kinds are the contents of the consciousness? Or how do you explain that? I mean, what are these 9 kinds? So before I go to Harshad Bhai, I'd like you to say something on this.
Well, it's true that actually sometimes this is true in the Mahayana, they describe consciousness in terms of 8 consciousnesses. I've come across some things where there's a 9th, but generally they talk about 8 consciousnesses. However, it's just a manner of speaking and a way of differentiating different aspects of consciousness. For example, they talk about the sense consciousnesses, in a way, like each of the senses, as individual consciousnesses, like the visual consciousness, the hearing, taste, touch, smell, and so forth, 5. And then the 6th consciousness is the mental consciousness, which is the mind which is conceptualizing. So this is the troublemaker. Then it also describes 7th consciousness, which is a basic grasping at the self, a basic underlying holding to a self. And then the big one is called the alaya consciousness, or the ground consciousness. And this, however, so when I was talking in the talk, I was mainly speaking in terms of this 8 consciousness, the alaya consciousness, because it says that all the others arise from that. But it's also a way of just this way of differentiating the 8 consciousnesses serves to clarify certain aspects of the operation of consciousness and where the problem lies within that whole field. I didn't want
Thank
to
you.
go down that track. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Donal. We'll go to Dr. Harshad Parekh. Yes, please.
Hello. Thank you, Donal, and thank you, Dubeji. I agree with Dubeji when he said that the content of the consciousness will remain. There is no problem with the content like thinking and feeling. They will remain with us. But the real problem is that this intelligence which Krishnaji is talking about is not awakened. And generally, our mind is mostly living in thinking and feeling, and it multiplies when it is not observed. But there is one dimension within us human beings, this choiceless awareness or intelligence, which is buried under these dense layers of thinking and feeling. So when there is a discontinuity in our thinking and feeling, then there is a gap is created, and the intelligence which is buried under has a possibility to come above the plane of thinking and feeling and see clearly what this thinking and feeling, how they are coming and going. So this kind of intelligence is not awakened, but due to meditation or due to really looking very, very deeply at the source of thinking itself, such thing can happen. The mind can stop. And then there is a different way of looking. And sometimes it happens only temporarily. A person can come above the plane of thinking and feeling and see clearly, but then again it can vanish. But a person who is very curious and really want to look at the source of thinking itself, and that is what I did after reading Krishnamurti. I was very, very attentively wanted to look at the beginning of a thought, and my mind stopped, and it was a completely different feeling. It is like coming above the plane of thinking and feeling and seeing clearly. In that, there are no problems. There is no observer in that. There is only observation. So this thing is possible. But what we are trying to do generally is that we read many different um, spiritual teachers, and then we think about what they are saying instead of going directly within ourselves and looking clearly how these thoughts are coming. So the whole thing is non-verbal, but we get too much occupied with explanation, words, and different teachers said different things. And then even the one teacher like Krishnamurti can say one thing at one time, and other time he may say something else. So if we are going to rely on the words of Krishnamurti or any other Buddha, then we can get lost. But when we become very curious and look inward directly, the way Krishnamurti himself learned or the way Buddha looked at himself, in the same way, when we look, and then there is a possibility of this awakening of intelligence, and then this content will remain. Thoughts and feelings will remain, but they will no longer create anger, fear, jealousy, loneliness, boredom, because everything is seen very, very clearly. And not only thoughts and feelings are seen clearly, but even the tree and the outside object also look very, very clear and very fresh, very new. So such dimension is exists in human beings, only requires a great curiosity, attention, honesty, and not giving up. and really look at the source from where all our problems arises. Okay, I have said enough things. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, Dr. Pradeep Verma.
Yes, sir. Am I audible, Donal?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, okay. By birth, by birth we are conditioned, and what conditions is a flow of words and images, sounds in a constant movement. You see, our mind receives various words and expressions during dialogues, discussions, and even reading and listening to highly intelligent discourses. We are supplied with fragments of one known, unknown system we call life, we call human mind. And the key words are intelligence, intellect, ignorance, illusion, apparent and factual or actual, movement, horizontal, vertical, and no movement, then memory and gap, emptiness and fullness. You see, past, present, and future as time, all this goes with us right from the very beginning. Interestingly, there is no methodology. Interestingly, it has been emphasized, no methods, no methodology. Review of literature gives us more or less the same. That consists of known as chronological past. Krishnamurti warns us, with known you cannot understand the unknown and the unknowable, right? So questions remain. Words cannot quench the hunger of human mind. Now the main question is, even reading your book, The Main of Light, my energy moved with similar words, known, oblique unknown. Fortunately, they don't interfere in my life. Fortunately, to me as individual in whole, of whole, understanding whole dissolves most of our problems. Then the main question is independence and completeness of a moment. You see, is each moment whole in some way? Is every moment a new moment which doesn't become memory? You see, he is always, Krishnamurti has emphasized on instant, moment to moment. I think something like that, Kshanavad. What is a moment in Buddhism? Probably Kshana. You see, moment. But interestingly, from your discourse today, I got this beautiful from Nagarjun's consciousness is always empty. Very interestingly, because till now, we were given those content of consciousness is content. But in what the container, this says something about the container, it becomes empty all the time and gets conditioned in a movement. So this sounds quite reasonable and logical to me, that it's always empty or always hungry in a way. That's why it gets conditioned moment to moment. Thank you very much for giving me a patient hearing. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Pradeep Verma. Yes, we have about 12 minutes, so I'll request all the people to please be very brief. Yes, Dinesh Waghmare.
Are you able to listen to me, Mr. Donal?
Yes, yeah, sure.
In my views, in today's dialogue, the center point was there are two things: ignorance and gyan, which you talked. In my views, ignorance doesn't mean that the mind doesn't know its original nature or structure, but it is unaware of the source on which it works, and it is considering itself as the prime mover or itself as the main entity or doer. So this is the ignorance. And what is Gyan? Gyan means to unveiling the source behind all the game and getting the direct reflection in mind. means to have direct experiencing of the entity which is giving birth to mind and fueling it. Now, for this wisdom to reach, I wonder why people only see the similarity in JK and Buddha. JK said no path or way, whereas Buddha is given eightfold path. JK says, JK teachings say empty consciousness means content. He talked on negation. So Buddha never talked on negation. This negation is very close to Adi Shankara rather than Buddha. So my views are, under ignorance, we can only experience the contents and not the substratum consciousness. So it is the question of breaking the ignorance. This is what I feel. And people should also see the dissimilarity between JK and Buddha. In Buddhism, there are a number of things, vipassana, there are a number of methods, even jap is there, even vipassana is there, even other methods are there, even in Nagarjuna there are methods, even Tantric Buddhism is there, whereas in JK this is not there. So why do we see only the similarity and why do we not see the dissimilarity? What are your views?
Well, I think for our purposes here, was not really intent on comparing, say what Krishnamurti says and what the Buddha says or Nagarjuna. We're merely using the teachings as a means of exploring the question, rather than saying the Buddha said this and Krishnaji said that, and they agree with each other, and that's a different thing. But for for all of us in our, let's say, our inquiry into these fundamental questions, perhaps there's some, like even from the past teachers, teachings which seem to throw light on the issue. So it's, excuse me, in that spirit, I'm bringing in something from Buddhism, not so much saying that, try to compare what Nagarjuna or Sangha said is similar to Krishnaji and saying, well, we're on the same, the same team or something like that. But it's merely using the what are there in the teachings as a means of exploring. So it could easily, if I was familiar with Shankaracharya or some of Patanjali, you could draw from those sources that might elucidate the fundamental questions. I mean, it's not absolutely necessary, but in my own mind, it was not so much a comparative exercise, but just a means of exploring.
Thank you. Thank you, Donal. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Yes, Durga ji, please go ahead.
I hope I'm audible, sir.
Yes.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Good evening, Mr. Donal. Yeah, it's a very nice talk you have delivered. Gone into so many fundamental issues, like your knowledge in Sanskrit is, you can say it's commendable. It may be better than us who are supposed to have, learned Sanskrit in schools and all. Like you brought vasanas and samskaras and all that. Which is kind of, very common kind of words we are used to listening from our childhood days. So in depth, I haven't read, the Sanskrit words and all that. But I just would like to say, in spite of the fact that, Krishnaji spoke so beautifully, so exhaustively on each and every topic that is concerning our human existence and human life, but still he leaves us with with no crutches whatsoever. He just leaves you, in the plain open ground. He says, you fetch for yourself, you mend for yourself, So that compels us to go into all these other relative books, like I have been reading the Upanishads, which are the ancient spiritual texts, of Indian or you can say Eastern origin. So those also, we find lots and lots of similarities between, as you found out, a lot of similarities between Buddhism and Krishnaji's teachings. So I haven't read Buddhism so in depth, except, other than touching few aspects here and there. Those texts also give a lot of weightage to us, they provide some kind of a ground for us from where we can start inquiring and all that. That's one part. And second one is your definition, the way definition you brought about meditation is so beautiful. It's about understanding yourself, understanding the way you talk, the way you walk, and all that is part of our content of our consciousness as a human being. So in spite of being so vague, the content of consciousness, humanity and all, when we speak, it all looks so broad. It feels, it's out there. But then he brings it to our day-to-day living.
Mhm.
He says from there. You start from there, and from there you have to inquire. So if you just make it a theory, you really feel lost. And then when you bring it to your own life, day-to-day existence, there's a point where he says you have to start from there. At least those hints and clues he gives to us. So how to stand, where to stand, how to begin, and all that. Otherwise, he sounds so beautiful. At the same time, he doesn't give any clues. So that's one point I would like to bring to the forum. And the second thing is ending of consciousness. He says, as long as the consciousness, which is a part of our thought processes, which are deeply rooted in our conditioning, as long as we are existing in that field, as long as our mind cannot go beyond that, so we won't be able to understand what reality is, what the beauty of life is. Because we all are living in the past, we all got whatever the traditions, whatever the conditioning, we got inherited from our childhood days, from our parents, from our backgrounds, from our societies. As long as we look at life from that prism, how can we understand anything else? So he draws that question, and he doesn't give any answers of what is the reality like when the consciousness ends. He says he only brings us to that point. And I feel when we keep that as a target, that I have done my consciousness, then we are beginning to, we haven't started as yet at all. I feel there is nothing called ending at all, maybe. This is my point of view. It is understanding the things and seeing them in their perspective. That's all we can do. That's all there in our hands. We don't know what it is to end also, and we don't know what it is, what the reality will be. What all is in our hands and in capability is understanding things the way they are, and why the way they are. And in order to understand that, we have to understand the conditioning from where we were born into. To understand that, we have to understand our parents, why they were conditioned in such a way. That means it is just enlarging your field of understanding. That's what I feel. And maybe the awareness levels, the understanding that it starts setting in, maybe your conditioning and your consciousness, the way it had been, the way it was, it starts lessening its impact on you. Maybe your vision or your perspective start broadening or something like that. So that's all I had to say.
Thank you.
very much.
Thank you.
Shai.
Thank you very much.
I haven't
Thank
read
you.
your book. It seems like a promising book. Yeah, I'm going to read. Yeah, maybe if it is available in Amazon or something.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much
you.
for that.
Thank
That's
you.
all. Thank you very much.
We'll have the last question from Prasad Garu. Yes, sir.
Sir, Mr. Creedon is somebody who has devoted his life to the quest. One can see that. But for me, these controversies, what is consciousness, whether it is a content or is there consciousness apart from its content, and the things like that, they are all rather theoretical questions. I have no energy or patience to tackle those questions. For example, in Buddha or even in our ancient Hindu scriptures, there are so many terms to indicate your brain or your mind. So many terms with slight differences. Are we really concerned with all that scholarship and the Indian mind is so analytical, it can analyze, it can hair split. It can split the hair, or it can polish the egg, something like that. We are not possibly, I am not bothered with that. For me, Krishnaji's simple statements or Buddha's simple statements are good enough. All I need is only those things. Like when he says, see your conditioning. I mean, you don't require any scholarship to see that. All of us can see each one of us can see his own conditioning very easily. You are born into a particular background and all that. So what is important is how generous you are, how egotistic you are, how fearful you are. These are the things which matter. And how concerned you are about your death, how attached you are to your property, to your relations, how your affections are limited to a small circle, to your family, and we have crony capitalism now. All these things, these are the things which worry me more, concern me more, rather than these what is Sunyavada or things like that, They are all, because life is very short and we cannot devote our life to these Palmyra leaf books. So I think that is what Krishnaji meant also when he said, forget all your scriptures. Thank you, sir.
Very well.
Thank you, Prasad. Very well said. Thank you. Well, we have come to the close of the session now, and first I want to thank Donal profusely for being with us today and spending his time with us. Thanks a lot. Maybe in near future, we'll request Donal again to talk about some other thing. Donal, you wanted to say something?
Not really. It was thank you for inviting me, and I appreciate the various comments. The last speaker, I don't disagree with what he says, but again, Krishnaji produced quite a few books. He had lots of words.
Yes.
So it's quite a...
Yes. And he kept talking for 60 years.
Yes, yeah. So anyway, but thank you, and it's always good to explore these topics and hear different voices.
Yes.
I appreciate it very much. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Donal. Next Sunday we'll have Dr. Gopal Krishnamurti at 6 p.m. again. So if you are free, please do join us. Gopal Krishnamurti next Sunday at 6 p.m. Thank you once again. Thanks a lot. Good night.
Thank you very much, Dubey sir. Thank you. Thanks, Creedon. Thanks to all participants. Modak, please end it.